we get started, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Brady Swanson. I'm the new manager. You could still call me new. I've been here for about 8 months. New manager at the Warroad Heritage Center. And if you haven't been to the Warroad Heritage Center, I strongly recommend it. The other thing that I strongly recommend is visiting the folk school. I want to thank Brenda Yannick and the folk school for kind of sparking this idea, this History on Tap, this presentation, this project. So please check them out. They have some fishing stuff coming up pretty quick too. I would like to also preface that this is quite an intense study on Lake of the Woods fishing. So if you are kind of looking for information specific to one family that fished in Warroad or the area, we don't have a lot of information on every single family that came in. We do mention some of the key members of the entire story, because we're going all the way back to 30,000 years ago. And we're going to try and cover as much of the history as we possibly can. And this is about 45 minutes to an hour presentation. If there's something that you have a question on, feel free to raise your hand and we can kind of talk about it as the topics come up. Otherwise, if it's a real in-depth question, maybe we should save it to the end so we don't drag this on for too long. But I hope you guys enjoy. We will get started here. There are 9 kind of topics we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk a little bit about how the lake got here. We're going to talk about the first fishing that happened on the lake. We're going to talk about how commercial fishing began and when it began. We're going to talk about what did early commercial fishing look like in the area. We're going to talk a little bit about the change of ecology that happened within the lake. We're going to talk about some burbot, a fish hatchery. And then a lot of what we're going to be talking about is the contention of sports fishing and commercial fishing, and we kind of end on how the industry has changed. So let's begin. How did the lake get here? So we're going to talk about Lake Agassiz. So about 30,000 years ago, this entire area was covered completely with a glacial sheet of ice. And as you remember from school, those sheets slowly move across the land and carve the earth as it is, and that what we see today. And about 13,000 years ago, that ice had melted and formed a massive glacial lake. It's estimated to cover at least 170,000 square miles. It spanned across southeastern Manitoba, northeastern Ontario, northern Minnesota, eastern North Dakota, and Saskatchewan. If you can see in the bottom corner there's a little white spot. That's Beltrami Island. So if you're ever wondering where Beltrami Island came from, you can see Lake of the Woods just kind of around the corner there. So the one high spot in all of Lake Agassiz was Beltrami Island. So now the first fishing on Lake of the Woods. With archaeological finds in Minnesota, they date back to about 9,000 to 12,000 years ago. Exactly who those people are, we're not 100% certain. So when I was doing research on this, I was looking at similar lake tribes, and some of those were the Dakota Sioux, and some were the Ojibwe, but I did look across North America to kind of get a gathering of what topics and what kind of techniques that these peoples used. There's 4 key techniques that Indigenous peoples used during the time. There was netting, trapping, spearfishing, hook and line. And when I go through these, I really strongly encourage that you kind of take a look at what your practices are today and see if there are any similarities. So netting. Netting has always been the highest reward type of fishing. There were several different types of nets that Indigenous peoples used. There are scoop nets and dip nets, just like you would see them today. The one in the corner over my right, that is actually made from nettle stalk fibers. So natural fibers would be collected and woven into a string-like material where it could be made into a net. Now, the nets back then are substantially more fragile, so you can't be hauling in crazy amounts. You can't be leaving them out in the rain because they break. The one that you see on the left there, that's actually made from willow bark, and that's kind of a gill or a sen style net. Gill nets were used, but sen style is kind of the most common that we see, and it's a very high reward type of fishing as well. So floats would be attached to the top of a net while weights were on the bottom, and they would walk, two people would circle around fish and capture them. This method is still used today. If you want to go catch suckers in the Warroad River, you're more than welcome to try sen net fishing. It's fully legal, so it's a very popular method even still today. Trapping is another very common method, because you also don't have to be active in doing it. You set the trap and the fish come to you. So it's meticulous, but probably not as meticulous as weaving stinging nettles into a net. But willow or other type material would be made into a basket style of trap, and that trap would have a closing on the end and an opening with a no escape entrance, which narrowed down and had some pokey bits so that the fish tries to get out, they're gonna get poked and not want to. So you would bait that and catch the fish. There's another type, it's called a wooden or a stone weir. Stones or wooden stakes would be put into the ground into a narrowing entrance into a larger or area where the fish would be contained, where then you could take your nets to catch them. The next methods are spearfishing. So there's two types of spearfishing that I was able to find when I was doing my research. There's open water and on ice. So when Indigenous peoples would spear fish, they would do it at night, and they would run a canoe with a torch attached to the front of it. The torch not only did provide them light, but the glow from the fire would attract the fish towards them where they would spear them. The other method is so the other method is ice fishing, and ice fishing back then was a heck of a lot similar to ice fishing today. So a hole was cut in the ice, and in one hand you would have a wooden lure to attract the fish, and in the other hand you would have a spear. And you would sit inside of a small little shack, like you can see Martin Keg there in the picture, a small shack covered in canvas, and you would wait for the fish to spear. Unlike the people today, Martin Keg didn't have a heater and he didn't have a larger house, but the same principle still stands today. And then there's hook and line. Hook and line was common across many different Indigenous tribes all across North America. Hooks would be made from bone or wood, and then after Europeans came, metal would be used. They would be baited and attached to a natural fiber line like the birch bark fiber or the nettle fiber, and once a fish bit, then you would haul it in. Same principle as today, just a little bit simpler. So now we're going to switch to commercial fishing and when the Europeans kind of started fishing on the lake. I'm going to talk about a few of the things the techniques that these Europeans brought to the area from their previous experience with commercial fishing. We're going to talk about pound nets, spike nets, gill nets, and ice houses. So for the pound net, sometimes referred to as the pond net, this was a very common and a very effective strategy in capturing fish. So fish would be led by the lead, which is the long line of netting, and would towards the V-shaped heart of the trap, and which would lead to the tunnel, which was a no-escape, narrow entrance that would try and block fish from coming out. This would lead them to the crib. The crib is where the fish would be collected. So boats would pull up next to the crib, and they would use dip or scoop nets and haul the fish out of it. With pound nets, they were started off with very little regulations and kind of went up to having a lot of regulations back and forth throughout the time of commercial fishing. It was a catch everything that you can. Whatever fit in the net and didn't fit through the mesh would be captured. I do hear a train coming, so we'll probably pause for a little bit. It'd be a great time to use the bathroom, get a new beer, order a pizza. So the next would be fyke or hoop nets. Fyke nets were used throughout the time of commercial fishing. Sometimes they were referred to as hoop nets. It's a similar idea as the Indigenous basket trap. It has a wide opening that narrows into a no-escape entrance that traps the fish inside the net. They were not as popular and didn't contribute a substantial amount of fish caught during the commercial fishing industry. This one you can see does have an opening similar to the pound net, and some of them did even have leads that would direct the fish towards the net as well. Gill nets. So gill nets were one of the most popular methods on Lake of the Woods. The advantageous part of a gill net is that they're really inexpensive and they're highly mobile. So it didn't take a large amount of capital for a commercial fisherman to be able to start fishing. They needed nets and they needed a boat, and then they just needed some hard work. So gill nets were one of the most common, and the method is quite simple. The nets would have a gap in the mesh, and fish would swim into the net, and their head would fit through the hole, but their body wouldn't. So they would go to back out of the net gets caught in their gills, and they're stuck there. So they stay alive in the water, they just can't get out of the net. This was one of the most controversial methods of fishing throughout the years as well. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So, ice house. Now, an ice house isn't a shack that you and your friends pretend to fish in. In fact, it was a very well insulated building, and it was for the storage of ice. Back in the 1800s and the early 1900s, they didn't have massive refrigerators. So instead, they harvested the ice from the lakes and rivers that they were on. If you have ever seen the movie Frozen, they're doing the same thing. It's actually a really cool technique. This is actually at the boot fishery. You can see in the upper corner there, they're breaking off ice. It's kind of difficult, and maybe you should just come to the museum one day and take a real close, in-depth look at this picture. But horse teams were run up and down the ice, creating lines and making sure that you didn't go all the way through. You just saved a little bit of ice. And then they would cross back the other way, making rectangles. And if you broke through at any point, the whole thing could collapse and you could lose all your horses and people. So then after that, they would be broken off one by one, taken out of the water, and you can see the chute up there. That would be pulled by a team of horses all the way up until the invention of the gas engine, where gas saws and pickups would be used instead of horse teams. Eventually, refrigeration and ice-making machines would take over that industry.
Brady.
Yes?
You should mention where that is.
Yeah, so if you guys are curious at where this is and if it looks any familiar, if you look over here, this is where the Booth Fishery was. So that curvature in the wall right there is that right over there. So we're pretty much on the spot of where the Booth Fishery is. So we're going to talk about the start of commercial fishing on Lake of the Woods. So it's not exactly clear when it first started and who it was started by. However, Wilhelm Zippel is the man who is credited with being the first commercial fisherman on the lake. He came from Rat Portage. However, At Rat Portage, now Kenora, was established in 1892 or 1882, but the German immigrant came down here and started commercial fishing before anybody did up there. So yes, Wilhelm or William or Bill Zippel, he went by all of those, and it didn't make it any easier when his kid was also named William and also went by Bill. Like I said, he was a German immigrant. He settled in Chicago, moved to Rat Portage, which is now Kenora, and then he squatted in an area known now as Zippel Bay in 1885. Actually, shortly after he got here, one record said it was the same year that he got here, he actually built a road from his spot to Warroad so he could transport fish in the winter. Zippel's location actually ended up being quite the popular settlement, with lots of other early settlers into Lake of the Woods County coming towards and living near Zippel. Many families were around him, and included several buildings. He had his own fishery, his own post office, and a general merchandise store all on his property. Another man that is sort of credited with the start of commercial fishing is Alonzo Wheeler. If you guys have ever known about Wheeler's Point, it's named after Alonzo Wheeler. Some references have him coming to the area in 1879. However, a lot of references mention him coming after Zippel. I found a 1957 book on Minnesota history that covered commercial fishing, and it does list him as one of the founding commercial fishermen alongside Wilhelm. And by 1894, a little village named LeClaire pops up. And if you've never heard of LeClaire, it's because it didn't last very long. There were 3 fishing villages, or 3 packing stations. Zippel Bay had one, like I said, and then there was the Sandusky Fish Company and the Baltimore Packing Company. Both of those locations were on Oak Point. You may know this area as Curry's Island. If you can remember, over just by Wheeler's Point there, in the Rainy River. Also known as the Gap. So that used to be referenced as Oak Point, and a little village popped up called LeClaire. It was named after E.T. LeClaire. He was the manager of the Baltimore Packing Company, and he got titled with the name. And unfortunately, we don't really have any information on the Baltimore Packing Company, so we don't know where it went or how it developed, or even what happened to E.T. LeClaire. So they had their own post office even, and from 1898 to 1902, the island had an operating post office. Here is the post office. It's not top shape, but for a bunch of men who are working at a fish packing plant, it's probably state of the art. Most of the inhabitants were men, but there were other folks that lived there. The Ojibwe had a bunch of teepees set up there. They had their own little village, but it isn't quite sure whether or not they worked for the fish packing company, but it would seem most likely that they did. By 1915, the place had been abandoned, and floodwaters actually had washed away all of the buildings, and it ceased to exist. But by that time, everyone had already moved. And they would bring them to different markets like Stephen. They would bring them to Fargo, to Winnipeg, where they would be sold. This was a prime method to transport fish during the winter. However, in the summer, as Fred used to say, I used to start out from Long Point at about noon as to make Warroad before dark, as it was too far to drive Roseau in a day. No matter how much ice you packed in a box, there's no way a fish is going to stay fresh till all the way to Stephen. So what they did was, with the water was open, barges or ships would go to all of the fisheries on the lake and transport all the fish up to Kenora, where they would be transported by rail. So that's where Mr. Daniel Highland, the first customs officer in LeClaire, that's where he got his job. He was checking all of these fish boxes that were going into Canada. Once the Canadian Northern arrived in 1900 and the Great Northern in 1909 came to Warroad, all of the fish businesses and the packing plants started moving towards Warroad because of the accessibility to transport. Like I had said, Arneson's and Zippel, they headed over to Rocky Point and had their operation, while the rest of them moved to Warroad. So like I mentioned, Arneson's, Bernhard Arneson, he was another early commercial fisherman that began in 1897 alongside Zippel, and kind of took over the operation when it had moved to Rocky Point. So Sandusky Fish Company, we have a little bit more information on them. So one of the first fisheries on Lake of the Woods, this is some photos of the location in 1901. It was eventually purchased by the Armstrong Trading Company. They were a little bit larger of a company. They ran operations out of LeClaire, out of Warroad, and out of Canada. One day, the Armstrong Company was merged with Booth Fisheries, as you may know. Booth Fisheries was quite a large corporation based out of Chicago, and they merged with the Armstrong Trading Company and created a branch in Warroad in 1906. In 1909, Booth Fisheries erected an ice house, dock, and storehouse right on River Street, just right here where we mentioned before. So the Booth Fisheries, they did leave Warroad in 1957, so they didn't last the longest. But during this time, we did get some really cool photos. So this is on the, would be my right. Art Fish and Oliver Hurd are sorting fish at the booth. This was in the 40s. I also want to point out, I'm sorry about the fishes, but when I'm looking up fish pictures in our system, 90% of them are not fish, they are the family fish. So if you see a fish, could you please tell them I'm mildly upset at them. So yeah, and then on the left there, we've got some men sorting and grading fish at the booth. We've got John Feeling cleaning fish at the booth, and then the guy who's measuring the Tullibee is Mr. Sunby. He worked for the DNR, and he was inspecting Tullibee for tapeworms. So Selvogs was another large company that you may or may not remember. Hans and Siebert Selvog purchased a lot on the river in 1908 with plans on erecting a fishery. In 1916, the Lakeside Fishery of Chicago was established at the end of Lake Street, which was at the end of the railroad spur. Lakeside Fishery then became the Northwestern Fish Company, which then again changed to the Warroad Fish Company. Finally, after a fire had burned down the Warroad Fish Company, the Selvog brothers erected a new building and named it the Selvog Fish Company. I would like to point out that they owned the company the entire time. There was no reason to change the name at all. They just wanted rebranding year after year. So in 1928, Siebert had actually moved back to Warroad. He was working as the superintendent of the Redby fisheries. The Redby fisheries were actually set up by the state in 1918 during the war to help provide additional food for people. He was also working for the Department of Game and Fish in St. Paul. After Siebert had died, Lena Selvog ran it until George Berglund took over. George and Lucille actually ran it until about 1970 when E.L. Morey and Lauren Morey took over. And then in 1974, Morey Fish of Warroad operated until the commercial fishing had ended. Now, if that name sounds familiar, if you've ever driven in Motley by Morey's, it's the same family. Ed Morey set up his shop in Motley, but he would come up here to purchase fish during the boom of commercial fishing. So, fish terminology. So we're going to talk about some the kind of the nitty-gritty details about commercial fishing, but there's a couple things that I want to mention because it may be confusing, because it sure was confusing for me. We know them as walleye. However, they are almost never referred to as walleye. They're almost always referred to as pike, and pike is actually a condensation of yellow pike. Some fishermen used to just call them yellows. Rarely do you ever actually see them called walleye. Northern pike, on the other hand, are almost always called jackfish or jack. Sometimes they're called pickerel as well, which is a cousin of northern pike, so it's not even accurate. What makes it even worse is that the Canadians, when they sell whole fish, they don't call it walleye, they call it pickerel, and they're not even closely related. So. With lake sturgeon, they were often called rock sturgeon, though that's actually a common term used today. The one thing about sturgeon that I do need to mention is sturgeon sounds, because I found this in one of the reports I was reading, and I had no idea what it was talking about. How can you sell the sound of a sturgeon? Well, after over 4 hours of research, I found a term called isinglass. And isinglass is comes from a German word called Heusenblas, which means sturgeon bladder. And what that was is sturgeon bladders were harvested from the fish. They were dried out in the sun, and then you'd be left with this block of collagen. And the collagen now is used as like a natural glue. However, back then it was used for hundreds of years for clarifying or fining beers and wines. And what does that mean? Well, if you brew a batch of beer and it's got a bunch of yeasty bits in it and it's kind of thick and chunky and nobody wants to drink thick beer, so you would throw some of this dehydrated sturgeon bladder in there and all of that would go away. If you ask me how that works, I have no idea. So, burbot, they went by quite a few names: dogfish, lawyer, eelpout, ling. Some of those are still used today. Ling is in reference to ling cod, which is one of their saltwater cousins. Alrighty, so early commercial fishing. Where do we begin? Oh, how about that there were 0 regulations on the American side? So it opened up in 1888 on the American side. No regulations at all. In 1892, commercial fishing opened on the Canadian side. Canada immediately had a restriction. Each license had 1 pound net and 914 meters of gill net. That's about 2,800 feet. And the Americans in 1895, 8 years later, decided, hey, we should probably put some restrictions on these guys. So they limited it to 50-pound nets, which is an insane amount of fish that you can catch. Shortly after, the Canadians did allow up to 5-pound nets. In 1911, commercial fishermen were dropped down to a mere 25, and then in 1925, they were dropped to 6-pound nets per license. This later became 3-pound nets, and 3 was the standard all the way through. In 1911, gill nets were authorized on the U.S. side. However, they weren't actually used until 1917. A total of 69,000 feet of gill nets were allowed on the lake. In 1896, the number of pound nets peaked at 320 used on the lake in the Canadian and the American side. Let's see here. All of these figures that I've just repeated and the ones that are about to come up, they came from a really interesting article from 1911 from Everman and Latimer. It's called The Fishes of Lake of the Woods and Connecting Waters. This was actually intended to be an ecological study. They were just trying to find out what fish live in the water, what fish live in the lake, but it actually showed way more insight on the commercial fishing industry. The dates are from 1888 to 1909, and the stats were provided by Captain Arthur Johnson from Kenora and Mr. Paul Marshock of Warroad. Paul immigrated from East Prussia, and he settled near Zippel Bay, and he married Wilhelm Zippel's half-sister Lillian. He started on the lake as actually a pilot and a navigator. He actually piloted the ship above me, the Nemapuck, not the person, the ship. And he started commercial fishing in 1900, and he was partnered with Zippel. When Booth Fisheries had taken over the Armstrong, he was appointed the manager and moved to Warroad. He managed the Booth Fisheries for over 20 years before he quit and started his political career, and he was actually a state representative for quite a few years. So, from 1888 to 1909, the total catch in pound nets and gill nets on the U.S. side was 17,800,000 pounds. That was valued back then at $582,800. Adjusted to the $1,900, the equivalent spending value today was just under $22 million. The total caught on both sides was almost 25 million pounds. That total spending value today is roughly $32.2 million. The calculated fish were whitefish, yellow pike or walleyes, jackfish or northern, and sturgeon. Two of these types of fish are substantially less common today than the early 20th century. So like I said, sturgeon were a part of that. Sturgeon were king. It was the money maker. As Everman and Latimer put it, Lake of the Woods is the greatest sturgeon pond in the world. From 1893 to 1896, it had become great importance for commercial fishermen to catch them. In 1893, the catch in American waters amounted to 1.3 million pounds, and it was valued at $26,000, which is roughly $900,000 today. The yield of caviar from those fish was 97,500 pounds, which was valued at around $700,000 today. The amount of sturgeon bladders, like I had mentioned, was worth around $200,000 today. For a dollar value in 1893 alone, sturgeon made American fishermen roughly $1.8 million in spending value. This is not the only million-pound year of sturgeon fishing on Lake of the Woods. For Canadian and American waters, 1893, 1894, 1895, and 1896 all saw million-plus pound years. In those 4 peak years, sturgeon fishing on Lake of the Woods had brought the few men working around $10 million in spending value. Quickly after this peak, sturgeon numbers dropped significantly. In the next 13 years, the number of fish caught averaged 200,000 pounds a year, with some as low as 50,000. The total amount of sturgeon products that were harvested from the lake between 1888 and 1909 was 66% of that total revenue that I had mentioned earlier, that $32 million. So 2/3 of it was because of the sturgeon. Back in 1911, when Everman and Latimer were doing this study, they had suggested we should probably stop fishing them for a while because the numbers were going down. They suggested 4 years. However, the issue is more than just 4 years for sturgeon. One thing is they do blame overfishing to cause the massive population decline. There are articles that do support the idea that the dams in Kenora also cause population decline, and this is because any sturgeon that were born from the rivers on the northern part of the lake, they would never be able to spawn again because they couldn't go back. So all of the bloodlines that came from them would die. The other issue is that sturgeon are extremely slow growing fish. So males typically do not become sexually mature until they're 8 to 12 years old, and they can take up to 22 years. Females can take 14 to 33 years to become sexually mature, with most of them not being viable until they're 24 to 26. So compared to walleye, walleye take a maximum of 5 years before they can spawn again. So when you take out, let's say, 5 million pounds in 4 years, and you take all of the eggs that they could have hatched, it kind of drops their numbers. And Kenneth Carlander, he did a study kind of following up the Everman and Latimer article in 1948. He and his team only caught 7 sturgeon between 1939 and 1944 and had claimed that it's almost extinct. It became illegal in 1941 to keep any sturgeon that were caught in your nets. So, some sturgeon weren't the only ones that have population changes. So, From 1888 to 1909, whitefish actually consisted of a large percentage of fish caught in the lake. 3.5 million pounds were coming from the American side, with a total of 6.1 million pounds coming from the lake entirely. Now, today, you can catch whitefish on Lake of the Woods. However, it's almost exclusively on the Canadian side in the deeper parts of the water. Tullibee took over the fish after they had been overcaught. Tullibees kind of really peaked after the 20s and in the early 30s. Tullibee went from 10% of the catch to 50% in just a short amount of time. Because the Tullibees came in, there was a couple other changes that happened. The lake used to actually have quite a large population of mooneye and goldeye. They're similar type fish to Tullibee and whitefish, but they could not compete with all of the Tullibees that came in, and now it's quite rare, and Carlander pointed that out in 1948. Carlander also had mentioned that saugers were one of the most abundant fish of the lake, though Everman and Latimer in 1911 said it was a not common fish. Burbot even actually had a decline from Everman and Latimer, as they mentioned that it was one of the most common fish on the lake, while Carlander mentioned that it was not as abundant as formerly, but is still quite common. This might be because there was a change of heart towards burbot. In 1925, Joseph Rowell, he was a commercial fisherman, and him and his son had realized that their fox pelts were much higher quality after they were fed burbot. Right now, I would like everyone to direct their attention to the left-hand picture and look at all those baby foxes. They are adorable. And so they were fed burbot, and the Rowells had discovered that their coats were such better quality. Well, Ted Rowell had actually spent a year doing tests on burbot oil, found that it was exceptionally high in vitamin A and D. It's 6 to 8 times more potent than cod liver oil. Now, burbot are a distant freshwater cousin of the cod, and cod liver oil had been really popular since the late 1700s and was quite popular in the 1800s. They began the Burbot Liver Products Company, which later became the Rowell Laboratories Incorporated in Baudette. That name is actually still in operation today. By 1940 to 1941, the Burbot Liver Products Company was purchasing 500,000 pounds of burbot livers annually. What started off as a junk fish turned this small company that the Rowell family started into a $1 billion+ company by the 1980s. The company transferred ownership several times, but Ted Rowell Jr., the grandson of Joseph, served on the board until 1991. Joe Rowell was not the only one to discover the power of burbot oil. Hans Selvog in 1931 also sent samples of burbot oil that he had made to several chemists, including H.A. Halverson, the state agricultural department chemist. His idea was a tad late, but the Selvogs went ahead and started the new fish meal plant in Warroad. So the Warroad fish meal plant was a short-lived operation. The idea behind the plant was to take the less desirable rough fish and make a profit. And actually, the building was to be owned by the fishermen and ran as a nonprofit. The goal was to take them, boil them down, make fish meal that would be fed to cattle and chickens, and then sell the fish oil outright. In 1930s, plans were starting, and then in 1935, they got a loan from the State Rehabilitation Administration, and if you read my newsletter, those are the same folk that did the Beltrami Island relocation project. They gave them $15,500 to start this, and then shortly after that, they had the plant up and running. They were able to process 24,000 pounds of fish every 24 hours. With those 12 tons of fish a day, it would be turned into 3 tons of fish meal and 120 gallons of fish oil. We do not know exactly how well it ran. However, we do have a newspaper article that was posted 5 years after it was built saying that the WPA had already taken the eyesore down and transported it to Washkish, where they were planning on planting trees and creating a park in that area. Allegedly, it is not confirmed, though the story is that folks around town were feeding their chickens the fish meal and the eggs began to taste like fish, so they quit buying the fish meal. There is another thing that we don't have any documentation on, though it would be nice to have it, was there were some burbot that had been sent to Indiana. There was a short amount of time in the 70s where burbots were being taken from the lake, live welled in trucks with a little bit of water, hauled to Indiana where people would pay to fish for them. I've talked to several people and all of them kind of, yeah, I think I remember that, but nobody really knows. So if you have any documentation on it, please bring it to the museum for us to dive more into. So Rowell wasn't the only person to benefit. His foxes weren't the only things to benefit from commercial fishing. Actually, a majority of commercial fishermen had their own mink ranches because they could easily take the bycatch that was worth nothing and bring it to their mink and be able to feed it for a low price. Those mink then in turn would be pelted and sold to the fashion market to make jackets and clothing. And it was a very booming industry. If you remember the mink ranches, they went from zero to everything in a very short amount of time. The Johnstons, Heinens, Flows, Brewsters, Selvogs, Picks, there's a whole bunch of names. The Heinens at one point had the second largest mink ranch in the entire North America. So that's how big of a deal it was. But just as quickly as it started, it's sort of faded relatively quickly. By the late 60s and early 70s, the idea of wearing mink became a negative opinion. People were having negative opinions towards wearing furs, and with that opinion, the markets crashed, and by the late 1970s, mink ranching ceased to become profitable. There's one thing that was missing from the lake, and that was a fish hatchery. Lake of the Woods had its own fish hatchery. Talks had even started way back in 1922, where they're discussing the potential installation of one. However, 1935 is when Baudette was seriously being considered for a hatchery. They had tested the waters around the area. The Warroad River was ranked third cleanest behind the Rainy River, and then the Winter Road River was selected as the cleanest. In 1938, the PWA, that's the Public Works Administration, they're different from the WPA, but they allocated $10,000 to start building the hatchery. Later, in 1939, the building was completed. They had a capacity of hatching 200 million walleye fry. In 1940, they first began their operation, but they were unsuccessful because they tried to get spawn from Rainy River, but the water was so polluted that they weren't able to hatch anything. The next year, 1941, they collected their spawn from the Tamarack River at Washkish, and that year they were able to hatch 70 million walleye fry. The next year, 1942, they were able to reach the 200 million walleye fry mark, and half of them were released into Lake of the Woods. We don't know exactly how long the hatchery was in operation, but it didn't last all that terribly long. So, all right, now we're gonna get to the juicy part, contest and controversy. So commercial fishing and controversy and feuding goes hand in hand, but there are a few years that we would like to highlight. There was some legislation that was passed during that time where that limited the amount of gill nets that you could use. Some were saying that you actually had to go pull your own nets. So some people would have licenses, pay other people to do their pull their nets, but this law had kind of said that. So this is kind of the first time we see some kind of heat The next heat was in 1940s. A lot of the information that comes from the 1940s heat is coming from Alvin Johnston's book, A Time to Fish and a Time to Dry Nets. Before I go into it a little bit more, Alvin Johnston was an avid commercial fisherman. He's very pro-commercial fishing. He even went to St. Paul several times to defend the practice. So he is opinionated. I'm not saying that he is not factual. I'm just saying that he holds a little bit more bias in his answers. But in the 1940s, Alvin had said that during World War II, the commercial fishermen were in the service. The sportsman groups from Roseau and Baudette, along with Ed Forte, who was the DNR game warden, had pushed to close the Northwest Angle fisheries. In 1947, George Arnold, Art Gidding, Bob Wenzel, and Marvin French were all denied renewal of their licenses. The main kind of goal during this time was actually to limit the amount of pound nets that were being used, because each of those licenses would have had 3 pound nets associated with them, so it limited the amount of nets that were being used. However, what ended up actually happening from that too was that the gill nets were even restricted, and to help kind of compensate for taking those 4 people's licenses, they took 1,000 feet from all commercial fishing license, so their total went from 4,000 to 3,000, and those allocated 1,000 feet went to those displaced fishermen so they could continue fishing. So these actions actually led Alvin Johnston, John Pick, Clarence Selbog to represent the commercial fishing industry at the Minnesota legislature in 1950. The compromise was that no new commercial fishermen or fishing licenses would be issued on the lake. So the winning was that they could still keep commercial fishing. However, they were no longer able to transfer their licenses to their children, and the industry was now tied to their lives. So once they died, the license would be taken, and they would never be able to get it back. The 1960s, this is arguably the largest battle in commercial fishing during my research. The controversy became because in 1961 and 1960 through 1964, commercial trawling had reached the lake. Now, trawling is a kind of catch everything that you can method. A large net is dragged on the bottom of the lake or ocean floor or in the midwater using floats. On Lake of the Woods, they used bottom trawls. A large boat pulls a net for a period of time until they haul the catch in and they dump it on the board to be sorted. So we have a lot of pictures. These are from the Jackie, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but W.J. Skidmore, he was one of the scientists that was working on the trawlers. They were collecting data to report back on the experimental operation. Skidmore mentions that the trawling is primarily used in oceans where trawling efforts can be directed primarily at one species and mesh sizes can be adjusted to meet local requirements. The trawl catch at Lake of the Woods is of both game and non-game species of varying vulnerability to the trawl because of differences in body shape and size. Chuck Burrows was the Minnesota Director of Game and Fish. He allowed 2 experimental trawling boats to fish on Lake of the Woods for the 1961 and 1962 seasons. One of the trawlers, named the Jackie, which a lot of these pictures come from, was owned by Harold Happy Flo, John Pick, Pulley Linder, Kid Linder, and Jim Eisenrich. John Pick was the skipper of this boat. The other trawler went by the name of the LC Jean or the JLC Jean. I've got references to both. You might recognize the JLC Jean as the boat that's up on the ridge. So that in the article was referenced as the LC Jean, but this one is called that one is called the JLC Jean. I believe it's the same boat. That one was owned by George Heinen and Julius Anderson and was operated by George Boucher. I'm sorry, George Bushy. The idea was to catch more rough fish to supply the exploding mink ranch operation in the area, which had outgrown the food supply from the commercial fishing industry. The other reason too was to modernize fishing techniques. Nothing had changed for nearly 70 years, over 70 years at that point. So trawling was the next best solution in their opinion. Alvin Johnson claimed that Chuck Burrow's idea was to replace the gill net fishermen and that walleye should be reserved for sports fishermen only. Because of this, conflict arose in Roseau and Lake of the Woods counties, and it went all the way to the state legislature. Groups of fishermen and resorts had banded together and formed sportsman groups. These groups were used for political gain and like signing petitions, fundraisers, and stuff like that. The commercial fishermen also formed their own groups so that they could advocate for each other as well. The only difference between those groups and other controversies that happened throughout the years of commercial fishing was that during this fight, the commercial fishermen and the sports fishermen had banded together to defeat the trawling that was happening on the lake. So during the 1961 and 1962 years, the state had allowed 2 additional years for trawling fishing. 1963 and 1964, the 2 licenses were reissued to the owners of the Jackie and the LC Jean. With political efforts from both members, from both groups, they were actually able to convince the Minnesota State Legislature to not continue the licenses, and in 1965 the licenses had not been renewed, so they weren't allowed to fish anymore. This wasn't the end of the battle though, because the researchers that were on those boats had suggested that if we had removed all of the other commercial fishing, that 5 trawlers could be used instead. It wouldn't damage the walleye population and would knock down the rough fish population. Though the commercial fishermen who fished during that time said that the years after that the trawlers were here were really low years. So you could tell that the population had been knocked back. This was not actually the last time that that the trawlers were used on the lake. From 1968 to 1970, a University of Minnesota research project on fishery resources for Lake of the Woods. Eugene Heyerdahl and Lloyd Smith discussed fishery health in this report. They're still kind of trying to figure out whether or not trawls could be used on lakes like this. They mentioned that trawls had no negative consequences to the lake bed, which was one of the arguments that people had said. They did also mention in this article that the only well-investigated harvest technique that is capable of increasing the yield of the commercial fishery without adversely affecting the sport fishery is the bottom trawl. They also mention at the end of their article that it's a guess, as there's no real way to prove it, but because fishing theory indicates that removal of commercial fishing operation on Lake of the Woods could exercise a negative effect that would reduce the quality of sport fishing on the lake and would inflict an economic loss. This is something that I've seen in several of the articles that I read, was that almost all of the scientists were saying that both could live together, that they were both working well with each other. 1980s, this is the end. The last contention between commercial fishing and sports fishing was in the 1980s. Tourism and sports fishing were holding the majority opinion during that time. Alvin Johnson had mentioned in his book that there was some DNR research that even showed that more walleye were being taken by by sports fishermen than commercial fishermen. I checked out those articles that he had mentioned. He had mentioned one from the 70s and one in the 80s. The 70s article was investigational report number 324, and there was another one that was published in 1987. Which is investigational report 389, and that was a status and simulation of model of Lake of the Woods walleye fishery, and that one did mention that sports fishing had increased significantly. What didn't help the commercial fishermen was the 1981 sports fish haul was the lowest it had ever been in 4 years of creel data, which had been taken since 1968. So catch rates What's interesting is on Lake of the Woods, the rates were the lowest that they'd been in decades, but the catch rates were still substantially exceeded those of other large walleye lakes censused in the recent years. And actually the numbers that were caught on the lake resembled numbers similar to lakes that had no commercial fishing. This was kind of a final nail in the coffin for commercial fishing. All of the political pressure and all of the negative opinion from commercial fishing. In 1983, legislation was established and a quota buyout program was issued. It was a declining one too, so it was based off of the total of a 164,000 pound harvest of walleyes in 1 year, and it would dwindle every single year until 1991. They had planned to fully remove all gill net licensors by 1987. So the total buyout was roughly $70,000 that first year. A $2.50 surcharge was added on to each of your sports fishing licenses to help cover the cost for the displaced commercial fishermen. The law actually didn't state that you couldn't commercially fish anymore. What it stated was you could not use gill nets and you could not catch sports fish. However, there was no market for rough fish as they weren't suitable for human consumption. The mink ranching had ceased to exist, and with no other choice, the commercial fishermen had to take the buyout. In 1985, the last commercial fishermen had pulled their nets for the final time. The foundation of many communities around the lake and an industry that had lasted nearly a century had ended. Families such as the Arnesons, the Brewsters, Vicarious, Moyer, Parker, Hilborn, Sardiff, Ringling, Carlquist, Selbach, Bushy, Wenzel, Springsteel, Giddens, Pick, Johnston, Myers, Arnold, Hoover, and Gools, and so many others had to go by with new professions. Some of them had been second, third, and generations as well. So commercial fishing ends, and what do we have now? Well, what do we have today? Sports fishing has really dominated the area. It really replaced it rather rapidly. We have some information too from studies that it did really increase during this time. And tourism is a large contributor to the money that comes into the area. Resort fishing is extremely common, extremely good moneymaker. However, the one question that some people have today is, does resort fishing and sport fishing fill the gap in the hole in the communities that commercial fishing had? Some of these areas like Rocky Point, Sipple Bay, and Wheeler's Point, they all are in the shadow of an industry that brought so many people in the area, so much fortune, and so much heartache. And that ends our slideshow, and I really appreciate you all. Thank you all so much for coming and listening to me. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. We'll try and answer them. And if you don't have any questions, I would strongly encourage, we have a donation jar on the bar. We are a nonprofit. We want to continue offering free programming to the public, to Warroad, to the communities. We really want to give this history to you guys. And if you could donate to us, that'd be greatly appreciated. Any amount of money goes a long way for us. And we want to do more of these. I think this was successful. I really enjoy doing projects like this. So maybe next year we'll do a different topic. So really appreciate it all, guys. Thank you so much.